I am Juan Melendez, and I'll be discussing the events that occurred on the morning of March 28, 1979, where a series of mechanical and human failures at the 3 Mile Island nuclear facility contributed to one of the worst accidents in the history of the nuclear industry. Located near Middletown, Pennsylvania, the events that took place at 3 Mile Island were initially hidden from the general public and clouded by poor press releases from plant officials. I will discuss the history of 3 Mile Island, including the location of the plant, operating capabilities, construction dates and problems, and the governing bodies that controlled these operations. This include the initiation of the incident, failures of the pressure relief valve, circumstances leading to the reactor core becoming uncovered, poor instrument indications, and inappropriate operator actions. 3 Mile Island is located about 10 miles southeast of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, which is the state capital, and surrounded by the Susquehanna River. This portion of the country is mostly rural, and the citizens of the area tend to be very conservative. Many of the families that surrounded the 3 Mile Island site have lived in this region for generations. When the idea was presented to build a nuclear power plant, the population largely supported it. Members of the community trusted the nuclear industry and believed the government would be able to provide sufficient oversight of plant operations. Nuclear power was a cheap form of energy that would also provide many new jobs to the proud residents. These new nuclear jobs would also attract many former military officers and enlisted personnel whose values would match those already living in the area and help to strengthen the region. The land that the 3 Mile Island nuclear facility was to be built on was owned by Metropolitan Edison Company since the early 1900s. The approximately 800-acre site was often leased to farmers for decades. Fishermen and birdwatchers also frequented 3 Mile Island to enjoy the bounties of the land. Metropolitan Edison Company was partners with Jersey Central Power and Light Company and Pennsylvania Electric Company. Together, the three companies made General Public Utilities Corporation. Metropolitan Edison, an electric energy company, was in direct control of operations of the 3 Mile Island nuclear site. 3 Mile Island nuclear facility was designed to have two separate nuclear reactors, TMI-1 and TMI-2. The two reactors were to be built and designed by Babcock and Wilcox. Babcock and Wilcox was a very respected company that had achieved many accomplishments, including conducting process development for materials used in the Manhattan Project and researching propulsion systems for the United States Navy. Constructions for TMI-1 began in 1968 and the process went fairly smooth. Construction for TMI-1 was completed in 1974 and the plant started generating electricity. Construction for TMI-2 started in 1969 and did incur some difficulties. These difficulties stemmed from exceeding the project budget that caused construction delays. The delays suffered prevented TMI-2 from producing electricity until 1978, a process that took almost 3 years longer than TMI-1. TMI-1 was designed to be an 852 megawatt pressurized water reactor. TMI-2 was designed to be a 906 megawatt pressurized water reactor. A pressurized water reactor operates by having the reactor core create heat. This heat is then removed by reactor coolant water, which is maintained at an extremely high pressure, keeping the water in liquid form. The primary coolant that removes heat from the core is then pumped through small tubes inside the steam generator. The heat from the primary water then transfers its heat to the water inside the steam generator, creating steam. This steam then travels through the secondary piping towards the main turbine. The steam is used to spin the blades of the turbine, and the turbines are then used to power a generator that produces electricity. The steam in the secondary system then condenses back to liquid form and is pumped back into the system for reuse. The primary coolant that transferred heat to the steam generator is now ready to remove heat from the reactor and is pumped back towards the core. The normal operating primary pressure for the 3 Mile Island plants was 2,000. The evening before the catastrophe at 3 Mile Island started just like every other night at Unit 2. TMI-2 had just passed its 1-year milestone since it went critical, and the series of events that soon would occur would change the nuclear world forever. Down in the turbine building, auxiliary operators had been instructed to perform maintenance on the midwatch. This typical maintenance item is to clear a clogged resin plug in the number 7 condensate polisher. They typically perform this task by using compressed air to break up the packed resin beads to reinitiate the flow of water. However, this particular resin plug had been causing an issue with maintenance crews for hours, and they decided to try a new method. The workers decided to blow compressed air into the water and hoped the excess force would cause the water to clear the resin. Using the compressed air had an adverse effect. It allowed some of the compressed air to force its way past the stuck-open check valve. Along with this, the air also found its way into the pumps, causing a well-known phenomenon called water handling. The water in the instrument line caused such a disruption in the system that it triggered the automatic shut-off features for the feed water pumps, condensate booster pumps, and the condensate pumps. When the pumps became secured, the main turbine steam stop valves were in turn shut, causing the main turbine to become tripped and shut down. Through a cascading series of alarms and safety interlocks, the reactor tripped. When tripped, the reactor scrams itself by inserting all control rods, and the reactor is essentially shut down by slowing the chain reaction. These events would only be the start of a much bigger problem that was greatly influenced by incorrect operator action. In the control room, all the operators started to notice a dazzling yet terrifying display of colors and noise coming from the annunciator panels, where over 100 alarms were going off. Immediately following the securing of the secondary pumps, 3 emergency feedwater pumps started. These feedwater pumps were unable to pump water into the drying steam generators due to their discharge valves being shut. When the reactor was tripped, it was running at a continuous 97% power level. At power levels like these, there is a significant amount of heat that is still being produced in the form of decay heat. With the secondary being secured and no emergency feed water, decay heat caused primary plant pressure to rise. Once pressure reaches a certain point, a pilot-operated relief valve will open and relieve pressure from the top of the pressurizer. After the pressure is back within its specified range, the pilot-operated relief valve will reseat. However, this did not happen. In the control room, there's a light to indicate for the pilot-operated relief valve. However, this light only notifies the operators that power is applied or not applied to the solenoid. It is not to indicate position, yet that is what the operators assumed. Control room operators had seen this problem 1 year prior with this very valve. That specific incident occurred during pre-nuclear testing and caused no damage. Managers did not believe the malfunction to be a huge concern and took no action to correct the indication. During the incident, on March 28, 1979, the valve had been relieving pressure at a rate of 110,000 pounds mass per hour, or 220 gallons per minute. Engineers later noticed that the pilot-operated relief valve downstream temperature was 500 degrees Fahrenheit above the allowable limit for plant procedures. Before the upstream block valve was necessitated shutting, yet it was not shut for many hours. This temperature alone was another very good indicator that the valve was, at the very least, leaking by. The pilot-operated relief valve continued to relieve pressure for more than 2 hours, draining coolant from the primary system. The accident compounded at an amazing pace, with most of the action happening within the first minute of the secondary system's pumps being shut off. With so much pressure relieved from the primary, a lot of liquid and gases escaped into the reactor coolant drain tank. Unfortunately, the reactor coolant drain tank can only hold so much, and the pressure quickly reached the rupture disk limit of 192 pounds. This caused the rupture disk to burst and allow radioactive liquid to flow into the sump at the base of the containment building. When the radioactive water reached a designated level, the sump pumps automatically start. The water was then pumped outside the containment building to the radioactive waste tank inside the auxiliary building. An operator inside the auxiliary building noticed that the sump pumps had actuated and informed the control room. The operators in the control room were quick to secure the pumps. Though the rupturing of the reactor coolant drain tank and continued release of primary coolant, pressure had risen from 0 to 2.5 pounds inside the containment building. Temperatures had also increased greatly, rising from 120 degrees Fahrenheit to 170 degrees inside the containment building. These pressures and temperatures were taking 1 hour after the initiation of the casualty. With nowhere else for the ever-expanding coolant to go, these numbers continued to rise. With erroneous indications inside the containment building, still, no one had noticed that the pilot-operated relief valve was open, even though this would be a telltale sign of such an event. Within the first 2 minutes of the pilot-operated relief valve being opened, the reactor coolant pressure had dropped by an astounding 25%. At 1,640 pounds, the high-pressure injection system comes into operation. The high-pressure injection system is part of the emergency core cooling system, which maintains the core covered in the event of a loss of coolant accident. The high-pressure injection system is activated when there's a relatively small leak and the system pressure is still high. If activated, it is another telltale sign of a loss of coolant accident. Once the high-pressure injection system started running, it was initially introducing water from the borated water storage tanks to the reactor coolant loops at around 1,000 gallons per minute. This is just over 4 times the amount that's being released through the pilot-operated relief valve. Operators in the control room were unsure why the automatic system had initiated. The operators had seen the high-pressure injection system inadvertently initiated from a loss of feed water and thought this was just another situation. Operators saw no reason to inject new water into the plant because from their perspective, no water had really left. The operators had no instrument that told them how much water was in the core or if the core was covered. They instead relied on pressurizer level instrument. With that, they saw that the pressurizer level was increasing as time progressed. Throughout their training, the operators were always told not to let the plant go solid. So in trying to prevent this, they saw no reason to maintain the high-pressure injection system at 1,000 gallons per minute. At approximately 5 minutes after the automatic initiation of the system, the operators decided to secure one of the pumps and throttle down flow to around 200 gallons per minute. This action was not enough to squelch the fear of going solid. The operators then decided to open up the plug for the reactor coolant system draining in order to maximize letdown through the normal makeup and letdown system. With these efforts, the operators had significantly decreased the flow of water into the coolant system to 25 gallons per minute. This miserable flow rate lasted for the better part of the next 3 hours. It should be noted that a few minutes after flow was throttled, an operator from Unit 1 came over to assist and noticed that the block valves for the emergency feed water were closed and announced it. After hearing this, the operator in control room of the secondary side of the plant had to move a tag out of the way to verify the indicating light. Upon discovering that the valves were shut, he was ordered to open them. This action returned emergency feed water to the steam generators, which was drastically needed. Once open, the valves returned the secondary side of the plant back into operation and started removing decay heat. This all happened within the first 8 minutes of the casualty and was later deemed to not have directly affected the outcome of the casualty. Even after discovery for something that should have never been the case as per the Nuclear Regulatory Commission regulations, it took attention away from the worsening casualty at hand. Plant operators were just trying to stay ahead of the core going solid, which is what they thought their instruments were showing. The best way to describe this effect is to compare it with a manometer. This was due to a combination of two conditions. First, there was a stuck-open pilot-operated relief valve, which was the pressure relief for the system. The other action is actually caused by the first. With the pilot-operated relief valve open, there is a direct outlet to force out coolant, drawing the system to saturation pressure. With the system at saturation pressure, the water achieved a sustainable pressure for which it could turn into steam at its current temperature. Initially, there was nucleate boiling. Little steam bubbles formed that broke free and were eventually collapsed. Quickly afterwards, the steam bubbles were not collapsing since the current pressure and temperatures allowed for such a condition known only as departure from nucleate boiling. With many steam bubbles traveling through the system, they tend to rise and accumulate in high and low flow spots in the system, which essentially uncover the core. Soon the steam bubbles had become big enough presence in the system that the reactor coolant pumps were pumping a steam-water mixture. The pumps began to cavitate violently and vibrate the primary loop Bravo. Operators decided to secure the loop Bravo pumps at approximately 80 minutes into the accident. This stopped the violent vibrations that were seen and heard. Even after loop Bravo pumps were secured, there was still flow in both loops. This was true because both of the loop Alpha pumps were still in operation. However, 20 minutes after loop Bravo pumps were secured, the vibrations became so bad in the loop Alpha pumps that they were secured as well. Operators were satisfied with this action since they believed natural circulation would take place. This line of thinking turned out to be incorrect. When all pumps were secured, all the steam that was making its way around the system had nowhere to go but up. This especially made the situation worse because now the top of the fuel bundle became uncovered. With no means of decay heat removal, the core continued to heat up and boil up most of the primary water away. 1/2 hour after securing the pumps, it was estimated that the core became uncovered by more than half of the 12-foot fuel bundles. This marked the start of core damage. The excessive heat caused by the core being uncovered, the cladding surrounding the fuel began to break down and slump over. The superheated steam and zirconium alloy cladding covering the fuel rods created an immense chemical reaction. During this process, the zirconium cladding voraciously takes the oxygen from the water molecule, thereby freeing the hydrogen gas. Due to the pilot-operated relief valve still being open, hydrogen gas, steam, and water were escaping the system into the atmosphere of the containment building. A short while later, radiation detectors started to alarm, but no one truly knew why. Finally, after new personnel arrived on scene, they realized, through the use of computers, that the pilot-operated relief valve was stuck open. Immediately, the supervisor ordered the block valve for the pilot-operated relief valve be shut. 6:18 a.m., the block valve was shut, and that marks the first action that operators had done correctly. It took operators over 2 hours to perform a correct action, but then again, this scenario had never been trained for and was never even thought to be possible to happen. By the time that the valve was shut, reactor system pressure had dropped to 625 pounds. Approximately 10 minutes after the block valve was shut, a primary sample was taken. During the sample, there was a massive jump in radiation levels. The radiation readings recovered were 600 milligrams per hour, significantly greater than normal levels. Once the results of the sample were obtained, they gave a reading of 350 times that of normal radiation levels that normally occur in reactor coolant. With these two pieces of information, the control room operators were in shock. They realized fission products were being released. Immediately, the control room supervisor called out a site emergency. This was the first step to inform the public. Within minutes, the site manager had arrived and was immediately briefed on most of the details surrounding the last 3 hours. Nothing stood out to him except one thing: increasing radiation levels. Radiation levels were tangible and have strict guidelines about them. So immediately, at 7:24 a.m., called away a general emergency. He then promptly informed and dispatched the emergency team with a general emergency with a possibility of potential radiological release to the public. At this point, no one on the site knew about the core being covered. No one even considered it a possibility. After the general emergency was called away, the station manager had taken over command in the control room, and everything was still in disarray. He received the report of current cold lake and hot lake temperatures that were disturbing to hear. The hot lake temperature was upwards of 700 degrees Fahrenheit. At full power, the hot lake should be at its hottest at 600 degrees Fahrenheit. The cold lake, on the other hand, was around 300 degrees Fahrenheit. Typical difference between hot and cold lakes at TMI2 is only 50 degrees Fahrenheit. After receiving these incriminating hot and cold lake temperatures throughout the system were ordered to be taken. One of the most frightening readings was on the in-core thermocouples. Instead of reading regularly, they read nothing but question marks. Operators believed that the thermocouples were malfunctioning, but in all reality, they were reading out of range. Because viable information from the printout in the control room was unavailable, technicians were sent to measure thermocouples by splicing wires with their voltmeters. Many of the thermocouple temperatures came back too low to believe, but at least two readings came back above 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The technicians expressed their concerns about superheat condition and contemplated that the core was uncovered. This line of thinking was quickly disregarded by 3 Mile Island managers. At roughly 8:30 a.m., the control room decided to turn off the high-pressure injection system entirely. Shortly thereafter, they flip-flopped and had come to the conclusion to turn it back on, but this time at full capacity. This is the second action the 3 Mile Island staff correctly took to get the core back under control. Their initial judgment was to add as much water into the system as possible in order to collapse the steam bubbles by bringing the system back to normal operating pressure. The plan was when system pressure got close to exceeding normal operating pressure, they would vent to maintain pressure within band. This would be accomplished by opening and closing block valve. However, this action released more of the dangerous hydrogen into the containment building. Also during this time, the operators tried many times to restart the reactor coolant pumps, but to no avail. It should also be noted that the slumped over portion of the fuel had melted at the top center of the fuel bundle, causing a crusted blockage in the flow path. In this area, there was a substantial amount of superheated steam that would continue reacting with the zirconium cladding and produce more hydrogen gas. After 3 hours in this state, plant officials decided to depressurize the system and attempt to bring the decay heat removal system online. Others wanted to utilize the core flood tanks. Both ideas would require lower system pressure before being put into operation. In order to achieve their plant pressure goal, operators decided to vent steam from the steam generators out into the atmosphere. This would cause the system to depressurize and cool. Upon initiation of venting, to the public's horror, a giant pillar of steam started coming from the nuclear facility. Steam coming from a power plant could be caused by any number of things, but in this situation, it casted an eerie shadow over the already terrible day. Venting of the steam generators goes on for about 80 minutes and then was stopped by the vice president of Met-Ed. Stop order was based on the fears that the vented steam contained radioactivity. With the public starting to grow nervous, the two most senior people at 3 Mile Island site were ordered to brief the lieutenant governor in Harrisburg. Just when the plant manager was leaving to brief the lieutenant governor, there was a large audible thud heard around Unit 2. Most of the employees of the plant thought the erratic noise was caused by a ventilator dampener, when actually it turned out to be a hydrogen explosion within the containment building. The most likely cause of the explosion was due to the electrical signals used to open and close the blocking valve. It was approximated that 6 to 8 second burn happened, which caused the explosion and the subsequent 28-pound spike in containment building pressure. The pressure spike had happened in just under a minute. Plant officials disregarded the pressure spike, and the thud accompanied it as an electrical impulse. No one could fathom a 2 million cubic foot building pressurizing and depressurizing that fast. After meeting with the lieutenant governor, the vice president of Met-Ed was advised by one of his engineers of the possibility that the core had become uncovered. 3 Mile Island officials quickly determined that the best course of action was to repressurize the plant. They planned to accomplish this using as much water as possible and tried to get a primary coolant pump running to return force for circulation. Operators finally started putting this plan into action almost 13 hours after the start of the casualty. Once they successfully added a sufficient amount of high-pressure injection water into the primary system, the engineers came up with a procedure to start a reactor coolant pump. At first, they just bumped for 15 seconds, and after the successful bump, they restarted the 1-alpha reactor coolant pump. It would remain in operation for the next several weeks, keeping the system in forced cool-down situation. At the point, the reactor was in a relatively stable condition, and the major portion of the accident was behind them. Throughout the day, there were many misleading or misinterpreted instruments that led to frustrating situations and worsened the plant conditions. Along with human errors, there were a few major plant design flaws which greatly complicated the accident. To add insult to injury, the 3 Mile Island staff botched a series of press releases, creating more panic throughout the surrounding areas of the nuclear facility. Part of the fear from the community was due to the uncertainty of The many mechanical and human errors that caused the partial uncovering of the reactor core at 3 Mile Island exist as a great lesson learned by the nuclear community. New operating procedures for plant evolutions, emergency preparedness, and data reporting have been developed as a result of this accident. New operators are highly trained and regulated by the improved and watchful eye of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Nuclear facilities operate using the highest level of technology, and safety is considered to be the utmost important factor when designing and operating all equipment. The American public needs to be educated on the many benefits nuclear power can provide them. Not only will the creation of many new jobs increase our nation's economic stability, independence from foreign oil sources will empower the country. 3 Mile Island may stand as our nation's greatest nuclear failure, but the events that transpired on March 28, 1979 may also be our nation's greatest nuclear teacher.